far from the ruins of Berlin. Another kind of power was moving across the oceans, massive steel fortresses that floated like islands. These were the American aircraft carriers, the giants of the sea, and they were unlike anything the German Navy had ever imagined. When German officers captured near the end of the war first saw these ships with their own eyes, they were absolutely stunned. To them it was like witnessing a machine from the future, a moving city that carried its own world on deck. Before the war, the German Navy, known as the Kriegsmarine, had been built around tradition. Its pride lay in battleships and submarines, not in aircraft carriers. The Germans admired the power of ships where thick armor and heavy guns were the ultimate symbols of naval dominance. But aircraft carriers were seen as fragile, experimental tools, useful but not decisive. Even Adolf Hitler himself dismissed them as floating airfields, doubting they could ever survive a real naval battle. But before we continue, if you want to hear more incredible stories from the history, make sure to like the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. It's really fascinating to see how far these forgotten stories can really reach. Alright, by the time the war began, Germany's only serious carrier project, the Graf Zeppelin, remained incomplete. Resources ran out, priorities shifted, and the war turned against them. The Germans focused instead on their U-boats fighting a hidden war beneath the waves, while above the surface the Americans built a new kind of power. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, its navy faced a moment of deep shock and uncertainty. The destruction in Hawaii had left large parts of the Pacific Fleet damaged or sunk, and for a brief time it seemed as if Japan controlled the ocean. But what many people did not realize then was that this disaster would push America to create something far greater than it had ever built before. In the months that followed, shipyards along the coasts of California, Virginia, and New York began to roar with life. Factories worked day and night, powered by the strength of millions of American workers, men and women who built the machines that would sail across the world. Out of this industrial storm came the new generation of aircraft carriers, massive floating fortresses that changed the balance of power at sea forever. These ships were not like the small experimental carriers of the past. They were supercarriers, carefully designed to hold dozens of aircraft, hundreds of pilots, and thousands of sailors. The most famous among them were the ships of the Essex-class, a line of enormous carriers that became the heart of the U.S. Navy during the war. Each one stretched almost 900 feet from bow to stern and towered above the water like a steel mountain. Every part of their design had a purpose. The deck was a long, flat runway where planes could take off and land in constant rotation. Huge elevators lifted aircraft from the hangar below to the flight deck above. The engines were so powerful that the entire ship trembled when they roared to life. Inside, the corridors ran for what seemed like miles, filled with the echo of boots, machinery, and voices calling through the metal halls. Below-deck workshops repaired damaged planes in record time. Mechanics worked in the glow of red lamps covered in oil and sweat, their hands never stopping. Above them, pilots prepared for missions that could decide the fate of entire islands. The coordination between these thousands of men was breathtaking. It was not just a crew, but a living organism, every part moving together with precision and purpose. To keep these massive carriers supplied required an entire network of support ships, fuel tankers, ammunition ships, food carriers, and destroyers that protected the fleet. Together they formed what sailors called a task force, a moving city that could travel anywhere on Earth. Each carrier carried its own doctors, kitchens, machine shops, and even printing presses that published daily newspapers for the crew. It was this combination of technology, organization, and human spirit that made the American carriers so powerful. They were not just machines, they were symbols of what an industrial nation could accomplish when it turned all of its energy toward one goal. From the sky, they looked like gray islands drifting across the blue surface of the ocean, their decks alive with motion as planes circled and landed. From the inside, they felt like a world of their own, a maze of corridors, control rooms, sleeping quarters, and command centers where every second counted. The sound of engines never stopped, and the smell of fuel, metal, and salt air filled every space. By 1944, these ships dominated the Pacific. They launched waves of bombers and fighters that could reach any enemy target hundreds of miles away. Battles that once depended on the range of a ship's guns were now fought by squadrons of aircraft that carried the firepower of an entire fleet in their wings. The ocean had become a battlefield of air and steel, and the carrier was its beating heart. What made it even more astonishing was how quickly America had achieved this transformation. In just 3 years, it had turned from a nation still recovering from the Great Depression into a superpower that built ships faster than its enemies could destroy them. The United States didn't just produce 1 or 2 carriers, it produced them in numbers that overwhelmed both Germany and Japan. To the outside world, especially to the officers of the defeated German Navy, this achievement seemed almost impossible. They had grown up believing that the battleship was the ultimate symbol of naval strength. Yet here was proof that the future belonged to the air. The carriers had become the new kings of the sea. Each one of these American giants represented more than military strength. They showed the world that freedom, industry, and collective effort could build wonders that no single man or empire could match. As they moved across the Pacific like floating continents, they carried not only planes and bombs, but the promise of a new kind of power, one that combined human courage with technological mastery. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the war that had devoured Europe for 6 long years came to an end. The streets of Berlin were in ruins, and the once proud Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, was shattered beyond repair. The surviving officers and sailors were exhausted, hungry, and uncertain of their future. Many were captured by Allied forces and placed in temporary camps while the victors decided what to do with them. Among these prisoners were some of the highest-ranking naval officers in Germany, men who had spent their careers believing in the strength of steel battleships and the deadly efficiency of U-boats. They had studied naval warfare their entire lives, and many of them thought they had seen every type of vessel the world could produce. But in the weeks after their capture, they would witness something that changed their understanding of power forever. After initial interrogations in Europe, some of these officers were transported across the Atlantic Ocean to America. They were to be questioned further about Germany's submarine operations, naval tactics, and secret technologies. The long voyage itself was strange and humbling for them. Instead of commanding ships, they were passengers now, standing quietly on the decks of transport vessels as they crossed the same waters they had once hunted during the war. As they neared the American coastline, the fog began to lift, and shapes started to rise from the horizon. At first, the Germans thought they were seeing islands, dark, solid, and enormous against the pale morning sky. But as they drew closer, the islands began to move. Smoke curled from their stacks, aircraft sat in neat rows on their decks, and tiny figures, men, ran back and forth across the vast, flat surfaces. It was then that the truth hit them. These were not islands at all. They were American aircraft carriers. The captured officers stood silent, their eyes wide as the full size of the ships came into view. Some of the carriers were so large that the German sailors could not see from one end to the other. The decks stretched almost 1,000 feet, wide enough to hold dozens of planes, trucks, and cranes. The towering control towers, called islands by the American crew, rose high above the water, packed with antennas, radar dishes, and observation decks. The German officers had read reports about these ships, but reading about them and seeing them in real life were two completely different things. As their transport drew closer to the harbor, they could see flight crews moving with perfect coordination. Airplanes were being refueled, rearmed, and rolled into position for takeoff. Every man seemed to know exactly where to go and what to do. It was like watching a city at work, a place where machines and people blended together into a single rhythm. The German officers whispered to one another in disbelief. They had always been proud of their engineering, proud of the precision of their submarines and the massive power of ships like the Bismarck. Yet compared to these American giants, their proudest creations suddenly looked small, even outdated. One officer muttered that a single American carrier looked big enough to swallow half the German fleet. Another said that if Germany had possessed even one ship like that, the war at sea might have taken a different turn. When they finally arrived alongside the pier and looked up, the height of the carriers astonished them even more. From the waterline to the top of the flight deck, the walls of steel seemed endless. The ships did not just float, they towered, and yet, despite their size, they moved gracefully through the harbor, guided by tugs that looked like toys in comparison. Once they were brought aboard for inspection or questioning, the shock deepened. The interior of the ship was a maze of corridors, workshops, sleeping quarters, and control rooms filled with blinking lights and humming machines. Everywhere they looked there was motion, men carrying tools, officers giving quiet orders, sailors cleaning, checking instruments, or preparing aircraft for missions. The sound was constant, the thrum of engines, the clang of metal, the murmur of hundreds of voices blending into a steady, living heartbeat. The German officers had never experienced anything like it. Their own warships, even the most advanced ones, had felt cramped and tense. But this was something else. It was a world contained within walls of steel, a floating city with its own rules, its own energy, and its own rhythm. For the first time, they began to understand what America's true strength was. It wasn't just the machines or the weapons or the number of ships. It was the ability to create order and harmony out of chaos. Everything on the carrier served a purpose. Every crew member had a role, and together they formed a single, unstoppable force. As one German prisoner later recalled in an interview years after the war, standing on the deck of that American carrier felt like standing in the future. The noise of the aircraft, the organization of the crew, the scale of the operation, it was all so far beyond anything he had imagined. He said it was in that moment that he truly understood why Germany had lost. The United States had not only fought harder, it had built bigger, thought longer, and moved faster than anyone else. When the sun began to set, the carriers glowed in the orange light of evening. The wind carried the smell of salt and oil, and the faint hum of engines filled the air like a song of power. The German officers stood quietly watching as the planes lifted off the deck one by one, their wings catching the light as they disappeared into the clouds. None of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They had seen the future of naval warfare, and it was not made of battleships or submarines. It was made of these vast floating cities, machines that ruled both the sea and the sky. The American aircraft carriers were more than just warships. They were complete systems of operation designed to live and fight at sea for months without returning to land. Every part of their structure had a clear purpose, and every space inside the ship was planned to keep thousands of people working together in constant motion. Each carrier was a self-contained world. It produced its own power, made its own fresh water, cooked thousands of meals a day, and carried enough supplies to stay in battle far from home. The ship could refuel, repair, and rearm its own aircraft while still moving across open ocean. Nothing like it had ever been built before on such a scale. A typical American carrier of the Essex-class held around 3,000 to 5,000 men. Inside there were sleeping quarters stacked on multiple levels, long dining halls, medical centers with surgical rooms, and entire machine shops where parts could be built or repaired. The air inside was filled with the low vibration of engines and the constant hum of ventilation. The ship was alive with sound orders through loudspeakers, tools clanging, the movement of boots on metal floors, and the deep mechanical rhythm of engines far below. On the flight deck above there was an organized flow that never stopped. Planes were arranged in careful lines, their wings folded to save space. Crews moved between them in color-coded uniforms, yellow for flight directors, green for maintenance, red for ordnance, blue for handlers, white for safety officers. Each man knew his exact job and followed it without hesitation. The activity was continuous, refueling, arming, towing, and launching aircraft. During operations, the ship became a machine of precise coordination. Pilots waited in ready rooms, studying maps and weather reports. Mechanics checked every part of the aircraft before takeoff. On the bridge, officers calculated wind direction and sea conditions to prepare the deck for launch. When the signal came, engines roared and the first plane raced down the runway, rising into the air. Within minutes, dozens of aircraft could be launched, each carrying bombs, fuel, and orders for a mission hundreds of miles away. Below deck, the work never stopped. Crews cleaned the hangars, reloaded weapons, repaired damaged aircraft, and stored new supplies. Ammunition was lifted by mechanical elevators from magazines deep inside the ship to the deck above. Food supplies, medical gear, spare parts, and fuel were all recorded and distributed with the precision of a factory. Everything was documented, labeled, and counted. The success of the ship depended not only on its weapons, but on its ability to maintain constant organization. In the kitchen, called the galley, Cooks worked in shifts to prepare food for thousands of men. Giant ovens baked bread by the hundreds of loaves, while vats of coffee boiled from morning until night. Every meal had to be served quickly so the crew could return to their duties. Laundry rooms, barber shops, and even small recreation spaces existed below the decks to maintain daily life. For the sailors, the carrier was not only a workplace but also their home and their entire world. Medical teams were always on alert. With so many men working near heavy machinery and aircraft, accidents were common. The onboard hospital could treat burns, fractures, or shrapnel wounds without needing to reach shore. For serious cases, aircraft could evacuate the injured to a base or another ship within the fleet. To stay operational, the carrier relied on a steady flow of supplies from support vessels. Oilers and ammunition ships traveled with the fleet, refueling and rearming carriers while still at sea. These resupply operations were dangerous and required precision, as ships had to move side by side in open water while fuel lines and cables stretched between them. But this constant resupply system allowed the carriers to remain active in combat zones for months at a time. Every man aboard knew that his actions affected the efficiency of the entire ship. Even small mistakes could delay flight operations or risk the safety of the crew. The success of an aircraft carrier was based not only on technology but also on discipline, coordination, and planning. Orders were clear, routines were strict, and schedules were followed with military accuracy. To a visiting observer, especially one unfamiliar with such ships, an American carrier looked like a complete city. It had its own power plant, its own water system, its own communication network, and even its own rules and hierarchy. Every sailor had a role, and every minute was accounted for. There was no chaos, no hesitation, only a constant, measured cycle of work that allowed the ship to function as the central force of the U.S. Navy. From the outside, these carriers appeared calm and steady, moving slowly across the surface of the ocean. But inside, thousands of tasks were happening at once. Fuel being pumped, engines turning, aircraft being loaded, weapons being armed, and orders being relayed from one deck to another. It was this combination of scale, organization, and purpose that made the aircraft carrier more than a ship. It was a structure built for total war, capable of projecting power across oceans with precision and speed. By 1945, the United States Navy had turned these vessels into the center of its entire strategy. Each one served as a mobile airbase, command center, and supply hub all in one. They could travel anywhere, reach any target, and sustain operations without relying on fixed ports. The aircraft carrier had become the most complex and effective weapon system in the modern world, a true floating city of war. For the captured German officers, the greatest surprise was not only the size of the American aircraft carriers, but the sheer number of them. What they saw in American shipyards and naval bases revealed the true scale of industrial power that their nation had never been able to match. During the war, Germany had poured enormous effort into a few major warships such as the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, and the unfinished Graf Zeppelin carrier. Each of those projects consumed years of work and vast amounts of steel, fuel, and manpower. Even before completion, shortages of resources and constant bombing made it difficult to continue production. In contrast, the United States had transformed its entire economy into a machine built for quantity as well as quality. Every major shipyard along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts operated day and night, building new carriers, destroyers, submarines, and supply ships in an almost continuous rhythm. By the time the war was reaching its end in 1945, the United States had launched more than 24 Essex-class carriers and dozens of smaller escort carriers. New hulls rolled out of dry docks every few weeks. Construction schedules were measured not in years but in months. Specialized factories built engines, propellers, and radar systems, then shipped them by rail to coastal yards for assembly. The process looked less like traditional shipbuilding and more like industrial mass production. When the German officers visited American naval ports, they saw harbors crowded with carriers lined side by side, their decks covered with aircraft and cranes. Support ships formed rows behind them, each one loaded with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Warehouses stretched for miles, filled with supplies ready to be shipped overseas. The scene looked more like an industrial district than a military base. Everything was organized, labeled, and operating according to a schedule that seemed impossible to interrupt. Some of the officers who had been engineers before the war studied the activity in silence. They understood how difficult it was to coordinate thousands of workers, yet here it seemed effortless. The Americans had applied assembly line logic to shipbuilding, breaking down every step into repeatable tasks so that even complex warships could be built at unprecedented speed. To them, this efficiency was more impressive than any single piece of technology. They also noticed how the American Navy used its resources, materials that were scarce in Europe. Steel, copper, aluminum, aviation fuel appeared in massive quantities. Trucks arrived constantly with cargo and trains unloaded parts directly beside the docks. Even small items like cables, valves, and instruments were produced in standardized forms that could be replaced quickly. Nothing was handmade or improvised. Everything followed a pattern that could be repeated thousands of times. This level of organization reflected the strength of the American home front. While German industry had been fragmented by bombing and shortages, the United States had remained secure behind its oceans. Factories operated without interruption, supported by reliable electricity, steady food supplies, and a workforce that included men, women, and immigrants from every background. Instead of focusing on a few prestige projects, American planners concentrated on scale, ensuring that losses at sea could be replaced faster than the enemy could sink them. To the German officers, the numbers were staggering. They learned that American shipyards had produced not only carriers but also more than 100 battleships and cruisers, hundreds of destroyers, and thousands of smaller vessels. Aircraft production was even higher. Tens of thousands of planes built each year, many of them destined for the decks of the Navy's growing fleet. The statistics seemed unreal, but the evidence was right before their eyes. Row after row of steel hulls and flight decks stretching across the harbors. Some of the prisoners quietly admitted that this industrial capacity explained why the war had become hopeless long before the final battles. No matter how skilled their engineers or how determined their crews, Germany could never keep pace with a nation that could replace an entire fleet within months. Victory at sea, they realized, was not only about tactics or bravery, it was about production, transport, and supply. Fields in which America had achieved unmatched mastery. One officer later wrote that standing on the pier beside several Essex-class carriers made him feel as though he was looking at an entire continent turned into metal. Another described the scene as an ocean of steel that never stopped moving. They understood now that the American Navy's strength came from its foundation at home, a society that combined industrial planning, technical education, and abundant resources into a single continuous effort. In Germany, war production had depended on secrecy and pressure. In America, it depended on cooperation and coordination. Civilian companies built parts for military ships, unions negotiated work hours instead of fighting them, and universities trained engineers who could improve designs while construction was still underway. Everything was connected in one system, and that system produced results that no enemy could equal. For the captured officers, this realization was sobering. They had entered the war believing that technological superiority would guarantee success. What they saw in the American shipyards showed them that modern warfare was decided by something larger: the ability of a nation to organize, build, and sustain power on a continental scale. The aircraft carriers were simply the most visible symbols of that capability. When they left the docks and looked back at the long line of gray ships resting quietly in the harbor, they knew that they were looking at the true reason for Germany's defeat. It was not only the battles lost at sea, but the industrial race that had been lost years earlier. The Americans had built not one fleet, but several, and they had done it with speed, precision, and confidence. The aircraft carriers were proof of that achievement, massive, efficient, and ready to sail anywhere in the world. To the German officers, they represented the full weight of a nation's industry turned into motion. They were the visible face of modern power, the kind that no battleship, no submarine, and no strategy could overcome. For the German officers studying these ships, it became clear that America's success came from its ability to combine science, engineering, and organization into one seamless process. The aircraft carrier was the symbol of that combination. It brought together industry, technology, and training in a way that no other nation had achieved. Germany had many brilliant engineers, but it lacked the unified planning and mass production that allowed the United States to turn ideas into fleets. The two nations had also differed in their use of information. The Americans built extensive communication networks to coordinate their fleets, using secure codes, radar systems, and aerial reconnaissance. Every operation was supported by intelligence gathered from multiple sources. Germany, though skilled in cryptography and tactical radio, could never match this level of coordination on a global scale. The result was that American fleets could operate across vast distances as if they were a single connected force. The captured officers discussed these differences among themselves during captivity. Many agreed that Germany's focus on heavy battleships and submarines had been a mistake. The future, they concluded, belonged to carriers and air power. A battleship could only strike what it could see, but a carrier could hit targets far beyond the horizon. In modern warfare, the ability to reach and strike first was more important than armor or gun size. As they reflected on what they had witnessed, the German officers began to see the broader lesson. The United States had not just built stronger ships, it had built an entirely new way of fighting. It treated war as an industrial operation that required planning, communication, and production on a national scale. Germany, in contrast, had fought with outdated assumptions and a fragmented command structure. By the time the war ended, this difference in vision had already shaped the future of naval warfare. Battleships, once seen as the ultimate measure of power, were now secondary. The aircraft carrier had become the dominant weapon of the modern world, a mobile base capable of striking anywhere, anytime. For the Germans who saw these ships firsthand, the experience was like seeing the next era of warfare before it fully began. They realized that the true strength of a nation did not lie in a single weapon, but in the system that supported it. America's carriers were not just floating airfields, they were the visible proof of a nation that had mastered the art of total war through organization, production, and foresight. When the war finally ended in the spring of 1945, most of the captured German naval officers already understood that their country had been beaten long before the last battles were fought. The sight of the American aircraft carriers and the endless lines of ships in American harbors confirmed what statistics and reports had only suggested. Germany had lost not only on the battlefield, but in the factories, the shipyards, and the supply chains that powered the Allied war effort. The realization came slowly and quietly. There was no dramatic moment of surrender aboard a ship or in a ruined city for these men. Instead, it arrived as a process of observation and comparison. Every detail they saw around them, the organization of the American naval bases, the size of the ships, the steady rhythm of daily operations, demonstrated a kind of strength that was different from what they had been taught to respect. In Germany, victory had always been imagined as the result of bold tactics, daring commanders, and superior technology. The American system showed that victory could also come from scale, planning, and endurance. The carriers represented that difference perfectly. Each one was a demonstration of what happened when industry, engineering, and discipline were combined into a single continuous system. Some of the German officers admitted in later interviews that it was difficult to accept at first. For years, they had believed that the German Navy had some of the best engineers and sailors in the world. In many ways, that belief was not wrong. German ships were well built and technologically advanced for their time. But when compared to the American fleet, it became clear that skill and innovation alone were not enough. The Americans had applied those same qualities to a much broader foundation, an industrial base that could produce on a scale the Germans had never imagined. The realization was visible even in small details. German officers noticed how American ships carried spare parts for almost every piece of equipment, allowing repairs to be completed at sea instead of returning to port. They saw aircraft being replaced within hours of being damaged, with new planes rolled onto the decks from nearby supply ships. They saw new ships being launched before old ones had even completed their first missions. Every part of the system was designed to continue working, no matter what was lost in battle. In conversations among the prisoners, some tried to explain how Germany's defeat had come not from lack of courage, but from lack of capacity. They had fought with limited resources against an opponent that could build faster, supply longer, and recover more quickly. Once that difference became visible, The outcome of the war had already been decided. The aircraft carriers were the final undeniable proof of that imbalance. To them, standing on the deck of a carrier felt like standing at the center of a machine that never stopped. It was not about individual glory or heroic action. It was about precision, teamwork, and the ability to keep moving forward without pause. The German officers understood that their own navy had been built for a different kind of war, a smaller, more traditional one that no longer existed. The defeat was not just military, it was also intellectual. Many of the captured officers had believed deeply in the German idea of Kampfgeist, the fighting spirit that emphasized bravery and personal skill. But what they saw in the American system replaced that idea with something more modern, a collective approach to warfare that treated logistics and planning as weapons equal to guns and torpedoes. The Americans had won not because they fought harder, but because they built smarter. For some, this realization led to reflection rather than resentment. They recognized that Germany's strategic goals had never matched its industrial capacity. The country had fought a global war with regional means, while the United States had fought with the full weight of a continental economy. Every carrier, every supply ship, and every plane was a reminder of what total mobilization looked like when it was properly managed. After the war, a few of these officers were asked to provide technical and tactical insights to Allied analysts. Their reports often mentioned the same observation, that the aircraft carrier represented the new form of naval power. Battleships had reached their limits, and submarines, though effective, could not decide wars alone. The nations that could build and sustain carrier fleets would control the future of the seas. For the German officers who had once believed in the power of steel armor and heavy guns, the sight of American carriers operating like floating factories marked a turning point in understanding. The war had proven that strength in the modern world was measured not only by courage or skill, but by the ability to organize vast systems and keep them functioning under pressure. When they finally returned to Germany, many years later, to a country divided and rebuilding, they carried with them this knowledge. They had seen firsthand what industrial warfare looked like in its most advanced form. They had witnessed how technology and planning could turn the tide of a global conflict, and they understood, perhaps better than anyone, that their defeat had been inevitable the moment they faced a nation that could build such ships in such numbers. The American carriers, quiet and steady in the harbors where they had first seen them, became symbols of that realization. They were not monuments of victory, but proof of a system that worked. For the Germans, they stood as the final lesson of the war, the recognition that in the modern age, wars were not won only by soldiers or sailors, but by entire nations that knew how to turn industry into power. When the war in Europe turned against Germany, many German soldiers were captured by the Allies. Some of them were sent far from home, across the Atlantic Ocean to prisoner of war camps in the United States. The journey was long and strange. Most of them had never imagined they would end up in America, a country they had only heard about through propaganda and wartime stories. On the ships that carried them across the sea, they were guarded and unsure of what would happen next. Many expected harsh treatment or poor living conditions. They had seen what war could do, and they thought captivity would mean hunger, cold, and punishment. Instead, when they arrived in the US, they found something very different. The camps they were brought to were often built on farmland or near small American towns. Rows of wooden barracks stood behind barbed wire fences, watched by guards in towers, but the air was calm and the surroundings were open and wide, nothing like the destroyed cities they had left behind in Europe. But before we continue, if you want to hear more incredible and untold stories from the history, make sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button. And tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. It's really fascinating to see how far these forgotten stories can reach. All right. Some prisoners were surprised by how quiet everything seemed, how clean the buildings were, and how organized life appeared to be. Many of them were tired, underfed, and anxious. They had lived through years of rationing and shortages back home. Food was scarce in Germany, and even soldiers at the front often ate very little. So when they were handed their first meal in an American camp, a full plate with meat, vegetables, and bread, they could hardly believe it. For many, that moment marked the beginning of a completely unexpected chapter in their lives, one that would challenge what they thought they knew about their enemies. When the German prisoners first stepped into the dining halls of the American camps, they were unsure of what to expect. Many of them had been hungry for years. living on thin soup black bread that crumbled in their hands, and a few spoonfuls of potatoes or cabbage each day. They remembered cold nights at the front where food arrived late or never at all, and they remembered how hard it had been to find anything to eat in the last months of the war in Germany. So when they walked into a building filled with long tables, trays of steaming food, and the smell of cooked meat, they did not know how to react. At first, some of them thought it must be a mistake. The trays were full of real meals, not rations, not scraps, not the kind of watery stew they had grown used to, but full plates with beef or chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables, and even bread that was white and soft instead of dark and heavy. There were cups of coffee, sometimes even milk or cocoa, and the portions were generous. For many of the prisoners, it was the first time they had seen white bread in years, and they could hardly believe that it was being served to them. The enemy soldiers. The food was prepared in large mess halls that looked like army cafeterias, with long lines of men holding metal trays and waiting their turn to be served. American cooks, some of them soldiers and some civilian workers, served the meals quickly, joking and calling out in English that many of the Germans did not yet understand. The smell of roasted meat, cooked beans, and fresh bread filled the air. The prisoners looked around and saw baskets of fruit, jars of jam, and even bottles of ketchup, all things that had disappeared from German shops long ago. Many of them were shocked that their captors could afford such meals while the war was still going on. They had imagined America as a land of hardship and constant fighting, but here they saw plenty. Some prisoners whispered among themselves that the Americans must be pretending, that perhaps this was just for show to make them cooperate. But the same meals kept coming day after day. The surprise slowly turned into quiet disbelief, and then into gratitude that they would not go hungry again, at least for now. The first few meals were confusing. The white bread tasted strange to those who had grown up on coarse rye bread, and the sweet desserts, cakes, pudding, or ice cream felt almost childish to men who had not eaten anything sugary in years. The coffee was strong and bitter, and the American way of eating, with big portions and fast service, was unfamiliar. Still, even if some foods were strange, no one complained for long. Hunger quickly overcame hesitation. Before long, the dining hall would fall quiet, except for the sound of forks scraping against metal trays. Some prisoners later wrote that the first meal in the American camp was one of the most memorable moments of their captivity. It was not only the taste of the food that they remembered, but what it represented. It was a sign that their new life, though uncertain, might not be filled with the misery they had feared. Many had been told that Allied camps would be cruel, that prisoners would be starved or beaten, but the full plates in front of them told another story entirely. For the first time in a long while, they felt full, warm, and strangely safe. A few even felt uneasy about it. They knew that back in Germany, their families were standing in long lines for rationed bread and thin slices of meat. Some men looked down at their meals with guilt, unable to finish everything on the plate. Others wrote home telling their families not to worry, saying they were eating well and were being treated fairly. Some letters were censored, but enough got through to let German families know that their sons were not starving in America, a truth that was hard for many to believe. The American military made sure the prisoners received enough food because the Geneva Convention required it, but also because good meals kept the camps peaceful. Well-fed prisoners were less likely to rebel or try to escape. Many of the guards noticed that when the food was good, the prisoners worked better and behaved more calmly. In time, some of the cooks even learned to prepare dishes that reminded the Germans of home sausages, stews, and dumplings made with whatever ingredients were available. These small gestures made the camps feel a little less like prisons and a little more like temporary villages. The shock of those early meals stayed with many German prisoners for the rest of their lives. Some later said that it was during those first days, eating food prepared by the very people they had been told were their enemies, that they began to question what they had believed about the war. They realized that the people who had defeated them were not monsters but ordinary men who, despite everything, still chose to feed them well. The food became more than nourishment, it became a quiet lesson in humanity that they would carry back across the ocean when the war was over. In the first few weeks of captivity, the German prisoners began to settle into a strange new rhythm of life inside the American camps. Each morning, the same pattern repeated itself. The sound of a bugle or a whistle, the roll call at sunrise, the smell of breakfast drifting through the barracks, and the long line forming outside the mess hall. The routine was familiar enough to feel like army life, but everything else was so different that it often left the men confused and even uneasy. The biggest surprise and the hardest thing to get used to was the food. Many of the prisoners could not understand how a country at war could serve such rich meals not only to its soldiers but even to its captives. The cooks prepared breakfast with eggs, bacon, oatmeal, and coffee, so strong it almost burned their tongues. Lunch and dinner followed with meat, vegetables, and soft bread, sometimes even dessert. Some men ate greedily at first, trying to fill months of hunger all at once. Others hesitated, tasting the food slowly, half expecting it to be a trick or a short-lived kindness that would soon be taken away. It took time for them to trust what they were experiencing. Many had been told in Germany that the Americans were cruel, that prisoners would be starved or forced into hard labor until they collapsed. Yet here they were, sitting at clean wooden tables with more food than they could finish. It felt unreal. Some joked quietly that perhaps the Americans were fattening them up for some secret reason. Others laughed nervously, unable to make sense of it. But the good meals continued day after day, and soon the laughter faded into quiet acceptance mixed with disbelief. The Americans followed strict rules for prisoner treatment, and those rules came from the Geneva Convention. The food given to the prisoners had to be the same quality as what American soldiers received. This policy shocked many of the Germans, especially those who had seen how badly captured soldiers were treated back in Europe. For them, the fairness of it all was as surprising as the food itself. They began to notice that the guards were firm but not cruel, that the work was tiring but not abusive, and that the Americans seemed more interested in order than in punishment. Even so, adjusting to life in the camps was not easy. The German prisoners were far from home, and even good food could not erase the loneliness or the fear of what might be happening to their families. Some men felt guilty every time they sat down to eat. They knew their parents, wives, and children in Germany were struggling to survive on small rations and substitute ingredients. Letters home were rare and heavily censored, but when a few messages got through, families often replied in disbelief. They could not imagine that their sons were being fed better in an enemy country than they were in their own homes. At the same time, many prisoners had trouble getting used to the taste of American food. The white bread was soft and sweet, nothing like the dark rye bread they grew up with. Cornmeal, peanut butter, and canned fruit were strange to them, and some even thought these foods were meant for animals. The strong flavor of coffee and the bright red color of ketchup made them laugh or shake their heads in confusion. Still, hunger was a powerful teacher. After a few weeks, even the strangest flavors began to taste familiar, and most men found themselves enjoying what once seemed foreign. There were also cultural shocks beyond the meals. The prisoners saw American guards smoking expensive cigarettes and drinking Coca-Cola, things that had disappeared from German life years ago. They watched farmers outside the fences drive new tractors and trucks that looked shiny and untouched by war. Everything seemed to point to the same truth, that America had not been destroyed by the war the way Europe had. For men who had come from bombed cities and ruined villages, this peaceful abundance felt like another world. Inside the camps, the initial feeling of suspicion slowly turned into a kind of uneasy comfort. The prisoners began to trust that the food would not run out, that the guards would not harm them, and that the daily routine would remain steady. With time, some of them even started to look forward to meals as the highlight of the day. Breakfast was a moment to talk, lunch a time to share jokes, and dinner a small reminder that life could still have a rhythm, even behind barbed wire. A few prisoners were chosen to help in the kitchens, washing dishes, peeling potatoes, or serving food to their fellow inmates. These men quickly discovered that the Americans wasted very little and followed strict schedules to make sure every meal was served on time. Working in the kitchen also gave them small freedoms. They could taste food while cooking, exchange words with American staff, and feel part of the camp's daily life. Some even began to learn English by reading the labels on canned goods or listening to the cooks talk about baseball and home. Over time, the shock of abundance began to fade, replaced by curiosity and quiet appreciation. The prisoners realized that good food was not only about taste or comfort, it was also a form of respect. a message that even enemies could be treated with decency. For many, this was the most confusing discovery of all. They had been raised to believe that mercy was weakness and that the enemy would always seek revenge. But the full plates in front of them told a different story. By the end of their first month in captivity, most of the German prisoners had adjusted to camp life. They worked during the day, received their meals on schedule, and learned that the Americans would keep their promises. Some still felt ashamed of how much they were given, while others quietly enjoyed it as a small gift of fate. Yet all of them understood, in one way or another, that their experience in America was unlike anything they had expected when they were first captured. The food that had once seemed so strange had become a symbol of something larger, a sign that even in war, kindness could exist. And though the prisoners did not know what their future would hold, they would remember this feeling for the rest of their lives. The shock had passed, but the lesson stayed. Sometimes the greatest surprise is not the taste of new food, but the discovery of unexpected humanity in the people who serve it. As the weeks turned into months, life in the American prisoner of war camps began to follow a steady rhythm that almost felt normal. Each day started with roll call, followed by breakfast in the mess hall, and then groups of prisoners were sent out to work. The men had grown used to the strange new foods, and many even looked forward to the meals. But now another change came into their lives: work and the small payments that came with it. The United States government allowed prisoners of war to work, as long as the tasks were not directly connected to military operations. Most of the men were sent to farms, lumber yards, canning factories, and construction sites. Across the country, thousands of American workers had gone off to fight overseas, leaving behind a shortage of labor, especially in agriculture. The German prisoners became a quiet but important part of the home front workforce, helping to harvest crops, repair roads, and pack goods for shipment. For the prisoners, this work was more than a way to pass the time. It gave them a sense of purpose and something to focus on other than their captivity. The camps paid a small wage for their labor, not in American dollars but in camp coupons or scrip that could be spent at the canteen. There the prisoners could buy simple comforts like chocolate, tobacco, postcards, or shaving soap. Though the money was symbolic, it gave them a small taste of freedom, a reminder that they still had some control over their daily lives. Many of the prisoners were surprised by how fairly the system worked. They were assigned tasks according to their skills and physical ability, and American supervisors treated them with a kind of practical respect. Farmers often discovered that the German men were strong, disciplined, and eager to work. Some of them had grown up on farms themselves, and they knew exactly what to do with a plow or a shovel. The workdays were long, but the air was open, the sun was warm, and the guards were usually friendly. Lunchtime in the fields or at the work sites became one of the moments the prisoners remembered most clearly. Instead of thin rations or cold bread, they were given packed lunches that often included sandwiches, fruit, and sometimes even a slice of pie. The men sat together under the shade of trees or beside barns, eating slowly and talking quietly. It felt almost like a normal day at home, except for the uniforms and the guards nearby. Many could not help but compare the food in their lunchboxes to what their families back in Germany might be eating, and that thought filled them with both gratitude and guilt. Some prisoners told stories later of kind encounters with American civilians. A farmer's wife might bring out lemonade or cookies on a hot day, or children would wave from a distance as the prisoners worked in the fields. At first, the Germans were cautious and unsure how to respond. But soon they realized that these small acts of kindness were sincere. They began to see their captors not just as enemies, but as ordinary people living ordinary lives. These moments, simple as they were, helped break the invisible wall that war had built between them. When the men returned to camp after a day's work, tired and dusty, the sight of the mess hall felt comforting. Dinner was served on time, just as always, and even though the meals were sometimes plain, beans, stew, potatoes, they were hot, filling, and enough to keep everyone satisfied. The steady rhythm of food and work gave their days shape and meaning. Some said that it reminded them of life before the war, when they had known routine and purpose instead of fear and chaos. Inside the canteens, laughter sometimes echoed. With their small earnings, the men could buy cigarettes or small bars of chocolate, and they would sit together, talking about home or sharing stories about the farms they worked on. Cigarettes became a kind of currency inside the camp. traded for small favors, or simply shared as a gesture of friendship. In those moments, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a temporary village, where men from opposite sides of the war were learning to live side by side. The fairness of the American system did not go unnoticed. The prisoners understood that their good treatment was no accident. The guards and officers often reminded them that the United States followed the Geneva Convention, which required humane conditions, proper food, and reasonable work. For the Germans, this was sometimes hard to believe because they knew how Allied prisoners had been treated in Europe. The contrast made a deep impression on them. Some began to realize that justice and mercy could exist together, even in wartime. Over time, the steady work and decent meals began to change how many prisoners thought about America itself. They had expected cruelty but found fairness instead. They had expected hunger but found full plates. They had expected hatred but found a quiet, structured life that gave them a sense of stability. Even though they were behind fences, they were fed well, treated fairly, and given a chance to contribute to something larger than themselves. By the time winter arrived, many of the German prisoners had built routines they could depend on. They worked during the day, ate 3 regular meals, and sometimes gathered in the evenings to sing or play cards. Life was still limited, but it was not without dignity. The food and work, simple as they seemed, became symbols of something greater, proof that even in captivity, life could still hold purpose, order, and small moments of peace. When some of the prisoners were later asked what they remembered most about their time in America, many did not mention the fences or the guards. Instead, they talked about the meals after long days of labor, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the strange kindness of being offered coffee and pie by the very people they had once fought against. For them, those memories became a quiet reminder that even in a time of war, there were still places where humanity had not been forgotten. As the months passed and the war continued far across the ocean, something began to shift quietly inside the minds of many German prisoners. They had come to America as defeated soldiers, uncertain of their fate, and filled with ideas planted by years of propaganda. They had been told that America was a place of cruelty and chaos, where prisoners would be treated as animals and forgotten. But every day that passed inside the calm and orderly camps began to chip away at those beliefs, replacing fear and anger with confusion and reflection. In the evenings, after their work was done and dinner had been served, the camps often grew quiet. Some men played chess or wrote letters home, while others sat outside their barracks, looking through the fences at the open American landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. The air smelled of earth and grass instead of smoke and rubble, and the sky was wide and peaceful, so different from the bombed cities of Germany they had left behind. In those quiet hours, many began to think deeply about everything they had been taught about the war and about the people they had been told to hate. For the first time, they saw their enemy not as faceless monsters, but as ordinary people living ordinary lives. The guards were young men not much older than they were, often polite and even friendly. The farmers who supervised their work were patient and fair, offering water on hot days and sometimes sharing food from their own homes. The cooks in the mess hall greeted them with casual kindness, serving hot meals without judgment. Each small act of humanity seemed to tell the same story, that the world was not as divided as they once thought. The food continued to play an important role in this change of heart. Every meal reminded them that they were being cared for, even though they were prisoners. Some of them felt deeply ashamed as they read letters from home describing hunger and shortages, knowing that their families were surviving on little more than bread and potatoes while they themselves ate well in a foreign land. The irony was painful, but it also opened their eyes. It showed them that the stories they had believed about America of greed, cruelty, and moral decay were far from the truth. Conversations in the barracks began to take on a different tone. Instead of angry discussions about the war or fantasies of escape, men started talking about what they might do after it all ended. Some wondered what life in Germany would be like when they returned, and whether their country could ever rebuild. Others admitted quietly that they had started to respect certain things about America. Its fairness, its discipline, its strange sense of order mixed with freedom. A few even said that, if they ever had the chance, they would like to come back one day, not as soldiers but as immigrants looking for a new start. There were still moments of pride and resistance, of course. Not every man was ready to let go of his beliefs, and some felt angry at themselves for feeling grateful toward their captors. But even the most stubborn among them could not deny what they saw with their own eyes. The Americans followed rules, treated prisoners humanely, and seemed to believe that dignity was something every person deserved, even those they were fighting against. This idea was both comforting and confusing, especially to men who had lived under a system that preached strength through fear and obedience. Some prisoners began to find small ways to express their changing feelings. They painted, carved wood, or built model ships in their free time, often giving these handmade items as gifts to guards or camp staff. A few learned English and started reading American newspapers, trying to understand the world from a new perspective. The camp commanders sometimes allowed lectures, language lessons, or film screenings, and these became unexpected windows into American culture. Bit by bit, the walls in their minds began to fall just as surely as the ones around them would when the war finally ended. As word of Germany's collapse reached the camps, the mood changed again. Many prisoners were filled with sadness and uncertainty, not knowing what they would return to. Yet underneath that worry was also a quiet sense of hope. They had seen a different side of the world, one that had shown them compassion instead of cruelty. For some, this experience became a kind of moral turning point. The moment they realized that the values they had been taught to defend were not the only ones worth believing in. When the time came for repatriation, many of the prisoners looked at their American surroundings one last time with a sense of mixed emotions. They were eager to go home, to see their families again, but part of them knew that they were leaving behind something they would never forget. The meals, the work, the laughter shared with guards, and even the sound of the mess hall at dinner time had all become part of their memories. Years later, when some of them were interviewed about their experiences, they often spoke with quiet gratitude. They remembered how they had arrived hungry, angry, and afraid, and how they had left fed, healthy, and changed. They said that America had shown them not just food and fairness, but a lesson about humanity, that kindness could be stronger than hatred, and that even in war, the way a nation treats its prisoners says more about its true character than any victory on the battlefield. For many, the simple act of being given good food, bread, meat, coffee, and pie had become something far greater than nourishment. It was a message of peace, a reminder that enemies could still see each other as human beings. And when those men returned home carrying those memories with them, they carried a small piece of that lesson too. That dignity once shown could never be forgotten. When the war finally ended in 1945, the German prisoners of war in America began to realize that their long stay behind barbed wire was nearing its end. For some it had been months, for others it had been years. They had worked on farms, built roads, and learned to live within the steady rhythm of camp life. Now the world outside was changing fast, and orders began to arrive that they would soon be sent home. At first, many felt an overwhelming sense of relief. They longed to see their families, to walk again on German soil, to hear familiar voices and speak their own language freely. Yet as the days of departure drew closer, a quiet unease began to spread through the camps. The men had become used to the order and fairness of American life. They knew that on the other side of the ocean, Germany was in ruins, cities bombed to dust, food scarce, and families scattered. The thought of going home no longer felt simple. The journey back was long and uncertain. They traveled by train to ports along the East Coast, often seeing more of America than they ever expected to. They passed through green farmlands, small towns, and cities that seemed untouched by war. The trains were clean, and the people who watched from the stations often waved, sometimes smiling, sometimes simply curious. For men who had once come to this country as enemies, the farewell was strangely gentle. When they reached Europe, many were not sent directly home. Instead, they were moved to temporary camps in Britain or France for processing and questioning. For some, months passed before they could finally return to Germany. During that time, the reality of what had happened to their homeland slowly came into focus. The first letters and reports they received told stories of destruction and hunger. Entire neighborhoods were gone, factories stood silent, and millions of people were displaced. When they finally arrived, the sight was heartbreaking. Streets they remembered were now piles of rubble, churches and schools stood roofless, and families lived in cold, broken buildings. Many of the men found that their homes no longer existed and that their loved ones had been lost or moved to other regions. It was a strange and painful contrast to the calm order of the camps they had left behind. For the first time, they truly understood how much of their old world was gone. The food situation was especially difficult. Germany's supply system had collapsed, and rationing continued long after the war was over. Bread was hard and dry, meat was rare, and coffee was only a memory. For those who had spent years in American camps, eating regular meals of meat, vegetables, and soft bread, the return to hunger was a shock that felt almost unreal. Some of them said later that the hardest part of coming home was not the destruction but the emptiness of the tables. Yet along with the sadness came a quiet strength. The experience in America had changed many of the prisoners in ways they did not fully understand. They had seen how respect, discipline, and fairness could exist even in wartime. They had seen how an enemy could treat them not with hatred but with decency, and that knowledge became something they carried with them as Germany began to rebuild. Some of the former prisoners shared their stories with neighbors and families, speaking carefully about what they had seen in America. At first, people found it hard to believe. The idea that enemy soldiers had been fed well, paid for their work, and treated kindly seemed impossible when their own lives were filled with hunger and loss. But as more men returned and told similar stories, people began to listen. In the years that followed, a few of those former prisoners decided to return to the United States, not as captives this time, but as immigrants. They wrote letters to the farmers who had once employed them, who sometimes sponsored their visas or helped them start new lives. Others stayed in Germany but kept a small piece of America in their hearts, a belief that dignity and kindness were not weaknesses but strengths. For many, the memory of the food remained one of the clearest images of their captivity. They remembered the smell of bacon in the morning, the soft sweetness of white bread, the taste of hot coffee after work, and even the simple comfort of being treated as human beings. Those memories stayed with them for decades, growing softer with time but never fading completely. When historians later interviewed these men, they often said the same thing in different ways, that their time as prisoners in America had changed how they understood the world. It had shown them that enemies could share a meal, that compassion could survive even in war, and that sometimes the smallest acts, a fair wage, a warm meal, a kind word, could reshape a man's heart more deeply than any battle ever could. For those German prisoners, the journey to America had begun in fear and defeat. But the journey home carried something else, a quiet understanding that humanity could endure even through the darkest times, and though they returned to a country broken by war, they brought with them an invisible gift, the memory of full plates, fair treatment, and the realization that kindness, once shown, could never truly be forgotten.